Space watches are a very interesting part of watch collecting. When I say space watches, I mean watches that have been used in space. You have the history, the tie to a historical event, and you also have the idea that you have a watch being used in a very extreme environment, much like in deep sea diving, in an environment that would say, normally kill a person. I guess there's some sort of romanticism in having an item associated with these kinds of factors. Probably the most famous space watch that we know of is the Omega Speedmaster. From the perspective of Seiko, while there have been a number of watches from them in space, probably the three best documented ones would be number one for the 70s, the Seiko 6139 so-called Pogue, named after William Pogue, who took it into space. In the 80s, we have the digital A829. In the late 2000s, we had the Seiko Spring Drive Spacewalk, which was initially a prototype for self-pay astronaut, if you will, and eventually it went into serial production, and it was extremely expensive. Of all of these watches, to my knowledge, the Seiko Spring Drive version was the only watch that was built from the ground up to be used in space. Now, that's our perspective on fairly well-documented space watches from Seiko. Today, I'm going to be talking about arguably the worst documented space watch from Seiko, and that's what you're looking at right here. You would never know it by looking at it, but it's actually a very unique, extremely rare watch. And I'm going to try my best to shed light on this watch. There's still a number of mysteries, and perhaps a viewer will happen to know more and you can add to it, and that would be a great thing. But to start with, this was a JDM watch that was released by Seiko from about 1993 to 1995. Let me pull up a catalog image of it. And as you see, it was officially called the Space Navigator, which is a pretty saucy title that you would think more people would have been aware of. But as it turns out, I guess it didn't sell well. And it was only around for a few years, and that was it. It retailed for 100,000 yen, which for the time was one of the most expensive watches in their entire catalog. I imagine they were probably trying to align it with Landmaster, Scuba Master, Flight Master watches, but they didn't call it a Space Master, so I don't quite know what's going on. And as you can see on the dial, it doesn't say Space Navigator on it. It says 31 days chronograph, and we'll get to that. So we have this catalog from Seiko. It was a JDM watch. I contacted Seiko Japan and asking them if they had more information on it, aside from them being aware that it existed in their catalog. As far as they were concerned, it was from 93, 94 only. So perhaps it was only made for 1 year and they just had excess inventory that allowed it to be put into the catalog up to 95. I don't know. But clearly it sold poorly. And Seiko themselves, Seiko Japan, doesn't really know anything else about it. It's just a bit odd because that idea that they sold a watch meant for space travel. It was, Seiko's a legitimate company, so it wasn't meant to be a gimmick or anything, but they're really just, they don't know. I couldn't find any advertising, and in general, especially since this was an obscure JDM watch of the 90s, there's little information available on the internet in any language. I myself first learned about it from more experienced collectors who had talked about this Seiko space watch that was released in the 90s, and apparently an astronaut had been in space for about 31 days and took it there. That's the beginning and the end of what's known. So to try to tackle this, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of function and movement, and then we'll go on from there. At its base, it's a Seiko quartz with a 6M multifunction movement. Seiko was pretty into those in the 90s. I'm not a big fan of them. Like a lot of their multifunction quartzes from the 90s, they don't age the best. Sometimes you get sticking, and especially if someone's tampered with the movement, it can be a bit of a pain. But the main claim to fame for this is, you see there's a selector at 6 o'clock, and you rotate the crown to move the selector around, and that's the mode you get. You might be confused and see it's on alarm on. Well, this watch was a bit of a basket case when I bought it, and the selector had fallen off, presumably from a fall. As I was trying to figure out which mode it was in blindly, I made a mistake, and I ended up putting back in on alarm mode, and it's actually in time mode right now. I don't really want to disassemble again, so I just make a note that it's one space off. So it's on time mode right now, and you can go for alarm. You have a calendar setting, alarm setting, dual time, and stop W, which is stopwatch. And that's really the interesting thing here. When you set it to stopwatch, I'm a bit hesitant to do it because the hands fly around a lot and it drains the battery. And quartz watches from the 90s and the best of times sort of drain batteries, so I don't like to move it. So you'll just have to take my word on that one. But basically, the hands reset to 0 and they start counting. Now, see, again, the 31-day chronograph. So what happens is after you go past 24 hours, and you're on day 1, then day 2 or day 3 of your chronograph, the clever bit here is that in the chronograph mode, the calendar wheel becomes the day totalizer. So once you're in, day 4 and 12 hours or whatever, the hands will show you 12 hours, but the date wheel will show 4 to represent the 4th day of the chronograph running. And this goes up to 31 days, 23 hours, and I think 59 minutes. And obviously the 31-day limitation is simply because there are 31 days on the calendar wheel. So that's the first element of the watch's claim to fame. Now, to sort of complicate things, the 6M came in different versions. Typically you'll see like yacht timers. And there were a handful of 6Ms that also had that 31-day chronograph. But only this one has it listed on the dial, as if they were trying to tell you something. And the second part of this, oh, and incidentally, if you see the LY 123, that's leap year. So it's a perpetual calendar, I think, until 2099. Though keep in mind, when you have to change the battery out, you have to reset everything. And at 9 o'clock, that's a 24-hour hand. So we have that out of the way. So we have the 31-day chronograph. And you may ask yourself, well, aside from usually analog watches only have 12-hour totalizers, what's going on? What's so special about 31 days? Well, remember when I said there's not a lot of information? The one bit of information that's still available comes from a very important person, and that's famous Seiko engineer Iko Tokunaga of Tuna Can, etc. fame. I believe his old website is still being hosted, and he has a list of his top 100 favorite watches. I believe most of those watches he himself had been involved in designing them. He has a bunch of tuna cans. And at number 96, let me pull up the screen here, we have that very watch. And read what it says in English. It was designed for an astronaut to time themselves up to 31 days in space. This really leads credence to the idea that this watch, in particular, was designed to go into space. That's from one of Seiko's premier engineers, and quite possibly the man who actually designed this very watch. So that's the first main part of what makes this watch so special. The 31-day chronograph to allow you to count up to 31 days in space. The second bit is the bezel. Now, at first glance, you look at the bezel and you think, oh, it's a tachymeter. No, it's not. If you look here, you have velocity and you have altitude. This is, in fact, an orbit rule, and it's used to help figure out the speed of a satellite orbiting Earth. Now, how many human beings have ever used this? I don't know. But clearly, these two features together are strongly suggestive of a watch that was, in fact, meant to be used in space. So that's our perspective on function. We have a watch that has a 31-day chronograph and an orbit rule. Bezel. So that's the big clue we have. Next, you can look at the watch itself, and what you see is it's all titanium. It has an integrated bracelet, crystal is sapphire. Usually a lot of the 6Ms that you see are sort of middle of the road ones. Typically, again, you'll see them as yacht timers. But this was 100,000 yen, and it was their high-end watch. And it's definitely built to a higher standard, and it feels much better than the typical 6Ms. A lot of times in the 90s, they were bicolor, you know, gold, steel, that kind of stuff. And you obviously have the gold highlights on the hands and everything. But the dial is a really nice gray color, and since everything else is steel color, titanium steel color, it works, I think, a lot better. The bracelet is a bit annoying in that it's integrated, and it uses these teeny tiny little spring bars. I don't know why. And on the back, there's titanium, titanium, titanium alloy, but there's no mention of Space Navigator, even though the catalog clearly calls it a Space Navigator. It's one of the many mysteries of the watch. If they were creating something they were going to use, or it was supposed to be used for something so extreme, you'd think they labeled it, but they didn't. Next we have the chrono pushers. They're screw down, and when you unscrew them, or I guess screw them in, the pusher won't work. These, incidentally, if you happen to be looking for this watch, are an enormous pain. Usually they get corroded, just I think by sweat and debris, and I had a devil of a time getting them to work properly. But when they're pushed out all of the way, you can't use the pushers. And then they're screwed back in. To my knowledge, this is the only 6M that has this. Cute little features here. You have the play, stop, pause, and I don't know, is that rewind, I guess? Which I don't think I've ever seen on a watch, but they're nice little touches that tell you this is definitely a unique watch. And the weird little humps there. So that's the perspective of the watch, the movement, and the history that's known about it. Now, since this watch was released and sold from about 93 to 95, and according to Mr. Tokunaga himself, it was meant for astronauts, I figured, let me research Japanese astronauts who went into space in the 90s. And there's only, I believe, 3. So I started researching and looking for photos of them in space. Well, the thing is, in a lot of the different photos, you either can't tell what they're wearing or they're wearing different things. So I've not been able to find any specific photos showing this watch. The issue with that, and that's again why it was so particularly frustrating that Seiko Japan didn't have any more information on it, because you would have thought they'd sort of be proud of an accomplishment like that. But, I mean, look at how Omega's been milking their Speedmaster. But that simply wasn't the case. So if anyone is interested or has any desire or experience in continuing to look for photos of astronauts from the 90s that happen to wear this on the wrist, that would be interesting. But as of right now, I'm not sure. Based on its history, I think the likelihood is very strong that it was taken up into space for a month or so. Probably as a gimmick, much like anything else. I have another video where there's evidence that a 6159 diver was taken up into space as a favor for someone. And by the 90s, all sorts of watches have been taken up into space, so I don't think it was quite as special as something from the late 60s, early 70s going up into space. But that's the picture that we have. So I guess I would call it technically a space watch, but it was built to be a space watch, and based on the engineer, I believe it was taken into space, but I can't find any concrete evidence of someone wearing it. And again, the company doesn't have any information, and no one else really has any information on the internet as well. So that's what we have here. Yeah, I think it would have been a little bit cooler if they actually had Space Navigator on the dial, but they don't. But that's the watch we have. So it's a really nice quality watch. They're rare, they're not terribly expensive or anything like that. Again, in my experience, the multifunction 6M movements are a bit dicey, especially if they sit around for a long time. The hands sometimes stick. They, especially if you're on the chronograph and things like that, on these older quartzes, the battery will run down quicker. So for my purposes, I just wear it for time functions. And it's really comfortable, and it's just such a unique watch. You have a date magnifier on the dial itself, and the number font is unique for this one. I've not really seen any other Seikos that use a very, interesting. I'm not familiar with number fonts just as far as being able to tell it apart from others. It's just a very unique date wheel. So you have that going, and that's what we have here. The unknown probable space watch called the Space Navigator with the 6M23 quartz movement in it. And if anyone has any more information on it, I'd certainly be happy to learn more. But again, before I made this video, there was just about zero information aside from Mr. Tokunaga's old website. So I'm hoping this will shed more light, and maybe sometime down the road we could even learn which astronaut, presumably Japanese, did in fact take it into space. And that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.